In the spring of 1865, a woman in Richmond, Virginia, reportedly wallpapered her entire parlor with Confederate $100 bills. It was cheaper than buying actual wallpaper. The currency that had once purchased food, clothing, and supplies for a nation of 9 million people was now worth less than the paper it was printed on. Across the defeated South, people discovered that their life savings had evaporated overnight. The money in their pockets, the bonds in their safes, the notes they had accepted in payment for goods and services, all of it was worthless. Fortunes accumulated over generations vanished in an instant. Widows who had invested their husbands' estates in Confederate bonds found themselves destitute. Merchants who had extended credit to customers expecting payment in Confederate dollars discovered they would never be repaid. It was one of the largest and most complete financial collapses in modern history. And it raises fascinating questions that most people have never considered. What actually happened to all that Confederate money? Where did it go? Did anyone ever try to redeem it? What about the bonds that foreign investors had purchased? Did they simply accept their losses? Were there legal challenges? And what about today? Is that old Confederate currency sitting in your grandmother's attic worth anything? In this video, we're going to explore the strange, tragic, and sometimes absurd aftermath of Confederate finance. We'll follow the money from the printing presses of Richmond to the courtrooms of Washington to the auction houses of the present day. Along the way, we'll meet desperate investors, clever schemers, determined lawyers, and ordinary people caught up in one of history's greatest financial disasters. This is the story of what happened to Confederate money and bonds after 1865. The Confederate financial system, a house built on sand. To understand what happened after the collapse, we first need to understand what the Confederacy built and why it was doomed from the start. When the Confederate States of America was formed in February 1861, it faced an immediate problem. How do you finance a government? The new nation had no treasury, no tax collection system, and no established credit. It was starting from scratch while simultaneously preparing for what would become the bloodiest war in American history. The Confederate government had three options for raising money: taxation, borrowing, and printing currency. A healthy financial system would rely primarily on the first two, using printed money sparingly. The Confederacy did the opposite. Taxation was politically difficult. The Southern planter class that dominated Confederate politics was deeply hostile to direct taxes. The Confederate Constitution actually prohibited protective tariffs, eliminating one of the primary revenue sources available to 19th-century governments. When the Confederacy did impose taxes, collection was inefficient and resistance was widespread. Throughout the entire war, taxes provided only about 5% of Confederate revenue. Borrowing seemed more promising. In 1861, the Confederate government authorized a $15 million loan, backed by export duties on cotton. The idea was that European demand for Southern cotton would guarantee the loan's value. Southerners confidently predicted that cotton is king and that European powers would have no choice but to support the Confederacy to maintain their textile industries. This confidence was misplaced. The Union naval blockade disrupted cotton exports. European nations found alternative sources of cotton in Egypt and India. And the anticipated diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy never came. The loans sold, but they sold at increasing discounts. As the war progressed and Confederate prospects dimmed, that left the printing press. The Confederate Treasury, under Secretary Christopher Memminger, began issuing paper currency almost immediately. The first Confederate notes, printed in New York before the war began, were relatively well made and initially maintained their value. But as the war continued and expenses mounted, the printing presses ran faster and faster. By the end of the war, the Confederacy had issued approximately $1.5 billion in paper currency, an astronomical sum for the time. This doesn't include the hundreds of millions more issued by individual Confederate states, cities, counties, and private businesses to address the shortage of small denomination currency. The result was predictable: catastrophic inflation. In 1861, A Confederate dollar was worth approximately 95 cents in gold. By 1863, it took $20 in Confederate currency to buy what $1 in gold could purchase. By early 1865, the ratio had reached 100 to 1. In the final weeks of the war, Confederate currency essentially ceased to function as money at all. A Richmond newspaper reported that in April 1865, the price of a barrel of flour had reached $1,500 in Confederate currency. A pound of coffee cost $100. A simple breakfast could cost more than a skilled worker's monthly salary had been at the start of the war. People responded by abandoning Confederate currency whenever possible. They hoarded gold and silver, conducted barter transactions, or demanded payment in Union greenbacks, which held their value far better than Confederate notes. The Confederate financial system was collapsing even before Lee's surrender at Appomattox made it official. The moment of collapse, the formal end, came quickly, when Richmond fell to Union forces on the 3rd of April, 1865. The Confederate government fled south, carrying what remained of the treasury. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet hoped to continue the war from somewhere in the Deep South, perhaps Texas or even Mexico. They carried with them gold and silver coin, plus vast quantities of now worthless paper. The exact fate of the Confederate treasury has been the subject of legend and treasure hunting for over 150 years. Most historians believe the gold was gradually dispersed to pay troops and officials during the flight south, with the final remnants captured when Davis was arrested in Georgia on May 10, 1865. But rumors of buried Confederate gold have inspired countless treasure hunters and several fraudulent schemes. For ordinary Southerners, the collapse was immediate and devastating. Consider a typical middle-class family in 1865. They might have had several $100s in Confederate currency saved in their home. They might have owned Confederate bonds purchased as a patriotic investment. They might have been owed money by neighbors and businesses, debts denominated in Confederate dollars. They might have held mortgages or other notes payable in Confederate currency. On the 9th of April, 1865, all of this became worthless. The currency could not be spent. The bonds could not be redeemed. The debts would never be paid, or if they were, they would be paid in worthless paper. The mortgages were now in legal limbo. The entire financial structure of Southern society had collapsed. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological impact. People who had considered themselves wealthy discovered they were penniless. Merchants who had full warehouses found they could not pay their creditors. Banks that had seemed solid simply closed their doors. Their assets evaporated. One Virginia woman wrote in her diary, "We are utterly ruined. The money is waste paper. The bonds are waste paper. Everything we had is gone." A Georgia planter reported burning Confederate currency for kindling, noting bitterly that it was finally useful for something. The collapse was not merely financial but social. The antebellum Southern economy had been built on slavery and cotton, financed by a web of credit relationships denominated in dollars. When the currency collapsed, it tore that web apart. Relationships between creditors and debtors, between merchants and customers, between landlords and tenants, all had to be renegotiated from scratch. And there was no bailout coming. The 14th Amendment, debt repudiation as constitutional law. The victorious Union faced a question. What should be done about Confederate debt? Some argued for a generous approach. If the goal was reconciliation, perhaps the federal government should assume some portion of Confederate obligations, easing the financial devastation in the South. This had precedent. After previous conflicts, victorious governments had sometimes honored the debts of defeated enemies to promote stability, but the dominant view in Congress was different. Republicans argued that honoring Confederate debt would reward treason. It would compensate those who had financed the rebellion. It would create pressure to also compensate slaveholders for their lost property, the formerly enslaved people now freed by the 13th Amendment. The result was Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. The relevant passage reads, "Neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave. But all such debts, obligations and claims shall be held illegal and void. This was debt repudiation elevated to constitutional principle. The amendment did not merely say that Confederate debts would not be paid. It declared them illegal and void from the beginning. It prohibited not only the federal government but also the states from ever paying these obligations. The language was absolute and permanent. There was no sunset clause, no provision for future reconsideration. Confederate debt was void forever. This had several immediate effects. First, it eliminated any hope that bondholders might eventually be compensated. Confederate bonds had been trading at steep discounts throughout the war, but some investors had continued to hold them, gambling that a negotiated peace might preserve some value. The 14th Amendment ended that speculation definitively. Second, it prevented Southern states from assuming Confederate debt obligations. Some state governments dominated by former Confederates might have been willing to honor debts incurred by the Confederate state governments. The amendment made this unconstitutional. Third, it created a clear legal framework for the courts. Judges did not have to decide on a case-by-case basis whether particular Confederate obligations should be honored. The answer was always no. The amendment's language about slave compensation is equally significant. Slaveholders had invested enormous capital in human property. By some estimates, the total value of enslaved people in 1860 exceeded the value of all American railroads, factories, and banks combined. The amendment ensured that slaveholders could never be compensated for this loss, no matter how future political winds might shift. For former Confederates, the 14th Amendment was the final financial nail in the coffin. Whatever slim hopes they might have harbored for eventual compensation were now constitutionally foreclosed. The foreign bondholders, a case study in bad investment. Not all Confederate bondholders were Southerners. European investors, particularly British, had purchased significant quantities of Confederate bonds. Their story illustrates the international dimensions of the Confederate financial collapse. The most famous Confederate foreign loan was the Erlanger Loan of 1863. Mile Erlanger, a French banker with connections to the Confederate government, organized a bond issue worth approximately $15 million, denominated in British pounds, and backed by cotton. The bonds were sold primarily in Britain, France, and other European countries. They were marketed to investors who believed the Confederacy would win its independence, or at least negotiate a settlement that would preserve bondholders' claims. The cotton backing was supposed to provide security. Even if the Confederate government collapsed, the cotton would still exist and could be claimed. The Erlanger bonds initially sold well, trading above their face value in early 1863. But as Union military victories mounted and Confederate prospects dimmed, the bonds' value plummeted. By 1865, they were trading at a few cents on the dollar. When the war ended, European bondholders faced a choice: write off their losses or try to recover something. Some chose litigation. British bondholders in particular mounted legal challenges, arguing that the cotton backing should still be honored. They contended that the Confederacy had held cotton that should be available to satisfy their claims, regardless of the government's collapse. These efforts failed. American courts held that the Confederate government had never been a legitimate sovereign, that its obligations were void from the beginning, and that the 14th Amendment prohibited any payment. British courts declined to order seizure of American assets. The bondholders also tried diplomatic pressure. They lobbied the British government to intervene with Washington on their behalf. But the British government, which had maintained official neutrality during the war, was not inclined to create a diplomatic incident over the losses of private speculators. The bondholders were told, in effect, that they had gambled and lost. Some bondholders held onto their certificates for decades, hoping that some future political change might restore their value. When Reconstruction ended and former Confederates regained political power in the South, There was brief speculation that Confederate debts might somehow be revived. The 14th Amendment, however, made this impossible. The total losses suffered by foreign investors in Confederate bonds are difficult to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest hundreds of millions of dollars in contemporary terms. For individual investors, the losses ranged from modest to catastrophic. Some British families had invested substantial portions of their wealth in what they believed was a sound cotton-backed security. They learned an expensive lesson about political risk. The Erlanger bonds still exist today as collectibles. They can be purchased from dealers specializing in historical financial documents. The cotton coupons attached to some bonds promises to deliver specific quantities of cotton, are particularly prized by collectors. What was once a financial instrument is now a historical curiosity. Legal battles and lost causes. The 14th Amendment settled the question of Confederate government debt, but countless other financial disputes remained. What about private debts denominated in Confederate currency? What about contracts that specified payment in Confederate dollars? What about property seized during the war? These questions kept American courts busy for decades after Appomattox. One major category of litigation involved debts owed before the war that had been paid during the war in Confederate currency. Imagine a Northern creditor who was owed $1,000 by a Southern debtor in 1860. During the war, the debtor paid this obligation in Confederate dollars, which the creditor could not practically refuse. After the war, the creditor sued, arguing that the debt had not been validly discharged because Confederate currency was worthless. Courts generally held that such debts had been validly paid if the payment was made in good faith at the current exchange value of Confederate currency. If a debtor paid $1,000 Confederate when the currency was trading at 50 cents on the dollar, the payment discharged $500 of the underlying obligation. The creditor could sue for the remaining $500. But calculating exchange values was complicated. Confederate currency fluctuated wildly, and reliable exchange data did not exist for all times and places. Courts had to make judgment calls based on whatever evidence was available. Another category involved insurance policies. Many Southern property owners had purchased insurance from Northern companies. When their property was destroyed during the war, they filed claims. Insurance companies denied coverage, arguing that war-related losses were excluded or that payment in Confederate currency had discharged their obligations. Courts reached varying conclusions depending on policy language and circumstances. Some policyholders recovered, many did not. The litigation dragged on for years. Contract disputes were equally complex. If two parties had agreed to a sale at a price denominated in Confederate dollars, was the contract enforceable after the currency collapsed? Courts generally held that contracts were enforceable at the equivalent value in United States currency. But determining that equivalent value required the same complicated exchange rate calculations. The Supreme Court addressed several Confederate financial cases during the Reconstruction era. In Thorington v. Smith, 1869, the court held that contracts made in Confederate currency were generally enforceable, recognizing that Confederate money had been the practical medium of exchange in the South during the war. People could not simply be denied all recourse for transactions conducted during the conflict. But in other cases, the courts strictly enforced the 14th Amendment's prohibition on Confederate debt. In Branch v. Fees, United States, 1876, the court rejected claims based on Confederate bonds, holding that the constitutional prohibition was absolute. The last significant Confederate financial litigation occurred decades after the war. In the early 20th century, some holders of state bonds issued before the war, but sequestered by Confederate authorities, sought repayment. They argued that these were not Confederate debts, but rather pre-war state obligations that happened to have been caught up in the conflict. Most of these claims were rejected. The physical aftermath. What happened to the money itself? The Confederacy printed approximately $1.5 billion in paper currency. Where did it all go? Some was destroyed. In the final days of the war, Confederate officials burned currency rather than let it fall into Union hands. Individual Southerners burned their worthless notes in disgust or used them as kindling. Some currency was simply discarded as trash. Some was kept as souvenirs. Union soldiers took Confederate notes home as war trophies. Southern families preserved notes as mementos of the lost cause. The distinctive designs, featuring allegorical figures, portraits of Confederate leaders, and scenes of Southern life, made them visually interesting keepsakes. Some found creative alternative uses. The wallpaper story mentioned earlier may be apocryphal, but Confederate currency was definitely used for various non-monetary purposes: wrapping paper, writing paper, children's play money, and more. But a surprising amount simply survived. Confederate currency was printed on relatively durable paper, and notes that escaped destruction have persisted for over 150 years. Millions of Confederate notes still exist today in varying conditions. This creates an interesting market for collectors. Confederate currency is actively bought and sold, with prices varying based on denomination, date, condition, and rarity. Common notes in poor condition can be purchased for a few dollars. They make popular souvenirs at Civil War sites and gift shops. Many families have a Confederate note or two tucked away in a drawer somewhere, saved by an ancestor and passed down through generations. Rare notes in excellent condition can be worth thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. The most valuable Confederate notes are those printed early in the war in limited quantities, particularly the first issues from 1861 with their superior printing quality. Error notes, notes with unusual signatures, and notes with documented historical provenance command premium prices. The market for Confederate bonds is similar. Common bonds in poor condition are worth modest amounts. Rare bonds in excellent condition can be quite valuable. Some collectors specialize in Confederate financial documents, assembling comprehensive collections of notes, bonds, and related materials. Ironically, the currency that was worth nothing in 1865 has regained value as a collectible, though that value bears no relationship to the face value printed on the notes. A $1,000 Confederate bond might sell for $200 as a collectible, while a $1 note in rare condition might sell for $2,000. Scams and schemes. The redemption fraud. If you search online, you can find websites claiming that Confederate bonds are actually worth millions of dollars and can be redeemed for face value plus accumulated interest. These claims are entirely fraudulent. The scam typically works like this. A promoter contacts holders of Confederate bonds, often elderly individuals who inherited the bonds from ancestors. The promoter explains that the bonds are secretly valuable and can be redeemed through special channels, perhaps through the World Court, or through secret trust funds, or through some obscure legal mechanism that the government doesn't want people to know about. The promoter offers to help redeem the bonds for a fee. This fee might be a percentage of the anticipated recovery, or it might be a flat processing fee of several hundred or $1,000. The victim pays the fee expecting to receive millions. They receive nothing except excuses and requests for additional fees. These schemes have been operating since at least the early 20th century. They have defrauded countless victims out of millions of dollars. They are entirely based on lies. The 14th Amendment is clear and unambiguous. Confederate debt shall be held illegal and void. There is no secret exception. There are no hidden trust funds. There is no legal mechanism to redeem Confederate bonds. Anyone claiming otherwise is attempting fraud. The Federal Trade Commission, the FBI, and various state authorities have prosecuted Confederate bond redemption schemes. Courts have consistently held that these schemes constitute wire fraud, mail fraud, and various state law offenses. Promoters have been sentenced to prison. Yet the scams continue, exploiting people's desire to believe that the dusty old documents in their safe deposit boxes might be worth something. If you own Confederate bonds, they may have modest value as collectibles, but they cannot be redeemed for face value, and anyone who says otherwise is lying. Confederate currency and memory, the fate of Confederate money, is intertwined with the memory of the Confederacy itself. For decades after the war, Confederate currency served as a potent symbol of the lost cause. Southerners preserved notes not merely as souvenirs, but as relics of a vanished civilization. The currency reminded them of what they had lost. Not just the war, but an entire way of life built on slavery and cotton, and a social hierarchy that the war had destroyed. Confederate veterans organizations used currency symbolically. Reunions featured displays of Confederate financial documents alongside battle flags and weapons. The worthless notes were transformed into sacred objects, proof of sacrifice and suffering. This symbolic meaning shaped how Confederate currency was discussed and displayed. Museums in the South often presented Confederate money without acknowledging the human cost of the system it had financed. The currency was aestheticized, appreciated for its engraving quality, its design, its historical significance, while the enslaved labor that the Confederacy was organized to preserve faded into the background. In recent decades, attitudes have shifted. Museums increasingly contextualize Confederate currency within the broader history of slavery and the Civil War. The money is presented not as a neutral historical artifact, but as evidence of a regime built on human bondage. This recontextualization has sparked debate. Some argue that Confederate currency should be studied and displayed precisely because it reveals uncomfortable truths about American history. Others argue that collecting and displaying Confederate materials, even in educational contexts, can normalize or celebrate the Confederacy. The debate mirrors broader controversies over Confederate monuments, flags, and other symbols. How do we preserve historical materials without celebrating the cause they represented? How do we acknowledge the past without distorting it? Confederate currency occupies an ambiguous position in these debates. Unlike a statue erected decades after the war to celebrate Confederate leaders, a note printed in 1862 is a primary source document from the historical period itself. It can tell us things about Confederate society, economy, and self-image that no retrospective monument can. But how it is displayed, interpreted, and discussed matters. A Confederate note in a museum case with no context tells a different story than the same note surrounded by information about the enslaved people whose labor the Confederacy sought to exploit. The economic legacy, long-term consequences. The collapse of Confederate currency had economic consequences that persisted for generations. Most immediately, it destroyed capital across the South. The wealth that Southerners had accumulated in paper form, currency, bonds, promissory notes, vanished. This capital destruction came on top of the physical destruction of the war and the loss of enslaved property through emancipation. Historians have estimated that the Civil War destroyed approximately 60% of Southern wealth. Much of this was the value of enslaved people, which was never legitimate. But the currency collapse destroyed even the wealth that did not depend directly on slavery. This capital destruction had long-term consequences. The South entered the post-war era desperately short of investment capital. Money that might have been used to rebuild infrastructure, modernize agriculture, or develop industry simply did not exist. The region became dependent on northern and foreign capital, often on unfavorable terms. The collapse also taught harsh lessons about financial trust. Southerners who had trusted Confederate currency learned that government promises could become worthless overnight. This bred skepticism about paper money generally, a skepticism that persisted for decades. Some historians have argued that the Confederate experience contributed to Southern resistance to banking and financial innovation. Having been burned by Confederate currency, Southerners were reluctant to trust financial institutions and paper instruments. This may have contributed to the region's slower economic development compared to the North. The experience also shaped national debates about currency and monetary policy. The Greenback movement of the 1870s and 1880s, which advocated for expanded paper currency, found limited support in the South, where memories of worthless paper were still fresh. The silver coinage debates of the 1890s played out differently in a region that had learned not to trust promises printed on paper. What about state and local currency? The Confederate national government was not the only entity issuing paper currency during the war. Individual states, cities, counties, and even private businesses issued their own notes to address chronic money shortages. These local currencies present their own interesting stories. Some southern states issued substantial quantities of their own currency, supposedly backed by state credit. After the war, these state currencies faced the same fate as Confederate national currency. They were worthless. The 14th Amendment prohibited states from paying any debt incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion, which included state currency issued to support the Confederate war effort. But some states had issued currency before the war that remained in circulation during the conflict. The legal status of this currency was complicated. Was pre-war state currency tainted by Confederate use? Generally, courts held that pre-war obligations remained valid, while wartime issues were void. City and county currencies were even more varied. Some municipalities issued scrip during the war to pay employees and conduct local business when other currency was unavailable. After the war, the validity of these local currencies depended on specific circumstances. Some were honored by local governments, others were repudiated. Private currencies, notes issued by merchants, railroads, and other businesses, were theoretically obligations of those private entities rather than the Confederate government. In principle, a note issued by a Richmond merchant promising to pay the bearer $1 should have remained an obligation of that merchant, regardless of the war's outcome. In practice, however, most private issuers were ruined by the war's end. The merchant who had issued scrip in 1862 was probably bankrupt by 1865. His notes were worthless, not because of Confederate defeat, but because he could not pay them. Collectors today often find these local and private currencies more interesting than Confederate national currency. They were issued in smaller quantities, making them rarer. They often feature local imagery and reflect the particular circumstances of specific communities. A note issued by a small-town merchant tells a more intimate story than a mass-produced national banknote. Lessons for today: what can we learn from the Confederate financial collapse? First, currency depends on trust. The pieces of paper in your wallet have value because you trust that others will accept them. The moment that trust evaporates, so does the value. Confederate currency collapsed not because the paper deteriorated, but because no one believed the Confederate government would survive to honor its promises. Second, war finance has consequences. The Confederate government chose to finance the war primarily through the printing press, rather than taxation. This was politically easier in the short term, but economically catastrophic in the long term. The inflation that resulted impoverished Confederate citizens even before military defeat was final. Third, debt repudiation is a political choice. The United States could have assumed Confederate debt, as victorious governments have sometimes done. The decision not to do so, enshrined in the Constitution itself, was a political judgment about justice and Reconstruction. Reasonable people can debate whether it was the right choice, but it was undeniably consequential. Fourth, financial collapse has human costs. The statistics about Confederate currency billions issued, worthless by 1865, can obscure the human reality. Real people lost real savings. Families were impoverished. Lives were ruined. The collapse was not an abstraction, but a catastrophe experienced by millions of individuals.
Fifth, financial history is inseparable from political history. We cannot understand Confederate currency without understanding the Confederacy, its origins in slavery, its prosecution of the war, its ultimate defeat. Money is never merely technical. It is always embedded in social and political relations. Conclusion. So what happened to Confederate money and bonds after 1865? The short answer is, they became worthless. The Confederate government that had issued them ceased to exist. The 14th Amendment prohibited their redemption forever. The billions of dollars in currency and bonds that had circulated through the Southern economy became waste paper overnight. But the longer answer is more interesting. Confederate currency became a symbol of the lost cause for some, of slavery's defeat for others. It became a collectible, traded by hobbyists, and displayed in museums. It became a tool for fraud, exploited by scammers, preying on people's hopes. It became a legal puzzle, occupying courts for decades as judges sorted out the consequences of financial collapse. It became a historical document revealing truths about Confederate society that other sources might obscure. The physical notes are still with us, sitting in archives and collections in family drawers, reminders of a failed rebellion and its economic consequences. They can be bought and sold, studied and displayed. They cannot be redeemed. Perhaps that is fitting. The Confederacy sought to build a nation on slavery to preserve an economic system based on human bondage. That system was financed by currency and bonds that promised payment in a future that never came. The worthlessness of Confederate money is, in some sense, a judgment on the cause it served. But we should also remember the innocent victims, the small farmers and working people who had no choice but to use Confederate currency, who lost modest savings they could not afford to lose. The collapse punished the rich and the poor alike, the committed Confederate and the reluctant participant. Financial catastrophes are never entirely fair. Today, Confederate currency is worth exactly what the market will pay. A few dollars for common notes, thousands for rare ones, but its historical value is beyond price. It tells us something about what the Civil War cost, about what the Confederacy was, about what its defeat meant. It is a tangible connection to a past that shaped everything that came after. The money is worthless. The history is priceless.